Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being with us at this Meet the Mentor lunch. I'm thrilled to be your mentor today, so it's my Meet the Mentor session. Jeff is just interviewing me. I hope you guys are excited about that. Yeah? Okay. Exactly the response I was expecting. Look, we have just this incredible privilege to enjoy a really intimate session with someone that I may have given a very bad reputation to last night. Despite what I said, Jeff is actually a really sweet guy, right? Most of the time. Except when you get him talking about education, because he absolutely believes we should all be doing more. So from my perspective, I introduced him last night. I don't want to spend too much time wasted on introductions. So let me start with my first question. Jeff, this is a Meet the Mentor session, so actually we'd love to understand, what your childhood was like, what your experiences were like, and what actually brought you to the point that you were today, or you are at today.
So imagine that you're growing up in a world that makes no sense to you as a kid, right? That as a kid, the South Bronx where I grew up was a cold and violent place that the housing was falling apart. We lived with vermin. The heat didn't work. And school, instead of being a refuge, was a certification for most kids that you were not going to amount to anything. In the 50s, when I went to school, we did not pretend we believed that all children could learn. Kids were tracked meaning they decided by the second grade whether or not you were going to be in the 1 class or you were going to be in the 6th class. No one thought even the kids who were in the 2 class were ever going to amount to anything. And of course, everybody lived up to the expectations of the educators. So by the time I was in middle school, we went from the talented and gifted classes from 7-1 to 7-22, right? And just imagine the kids in the 7-1 class, people thought might graduate high school. By 7-4, they didn't expect you to graduate high school. So imagine if you're in 7-12, 7-14, 7-18. And this was just how I grew up. And it was, to me, one of the worst caste systems, right? This was impenetrable. You did not move from one grade to the next. You stayed in that grade. It was unusual that a kid moved up. Very unusual. It was shocking. It was not so unusual for a kid to move down. And one of the reasons I'm such a stickler on college, so my aunts and uncles, our family has been a bunch of educators, but almost to a person they were told, you're not college material. People would tell you straight and what they considered to be honest. They would look at you and say, you are not college material. And my brother Dan, who's 2 years older than me, and my mother literally rescued from a class in the 5th grade where he was put in with students where not only wasn't any education going, the kids were running and jumping on desks and everything else. My brother Dan sort of he just retired working as an engineer in a nuclear factory, but the system was determined to convince him, which they almost did, that he wasn't going to be able to make it. So you have this education system which is certifying your worthlessness in an environment that is also telling you you're not getting out of here. And so you look at the end result. You had alcoholism, you had drugs, you had gangs, you had sudden death, you had incarceration, you had early teen pregnancy. And all of this, I'm looking at this as a kid of 12. These are my friends. And I'm thinking, this is insane, because I knew literally just 20 blocks away, kids were growing up where there was a totally different set of expectations for those kids. And they were going to live a totally different life. So one of the great and the lousy things about living in New York was that you could literally cross a street and change your outcomes, right? If you look at any of the maps around education, around health outcomes. I mean, literally, where the minority populations begin, all of the outcomes turn to the negative. And that had a really devastating effect on me because not only was the culture totally against sort of an intellectual stimulation. Kids, and when I go to places today like that, kids would literally beat you up if you acted smart, right? So if you answered the questions, if you were like, oh yes, I know the answer, they would be waiting for you outside, and they would beat you up. And you imagine being 11. It didn't take much of that before you realize this is not working for me, right? I mean, and so you begin to see kids begin to adopt a culture, right, which prepared you for combat, for battle, that's what people began to really value, whether or not you were tough and other things. And it got so deep, right? So I managed to sneak through this whole thing, and I'm up at college, and I'm wondering, I'm at sort of a terrific college, I'm wondering why I have no friends, right? And later, so some of these guys who I went to school with in the 70s, they work with me now. And one day I asked them, why were y'all so mean to me? They said, Jeff, you were the most hostile person we had ever met. But that's how we were in the Bronx. You didn't meet somebody and say, hi, how you like? Yo, what's up, man? How are you, man? They were like, ooh, this guy seems a little tense, right? So this idea of what happened to all of so I've watched now all of my friends growing up. None of them made it. And you realize as little kids, they were just little boys and little girls. They had hopes and dreams that were crushed before they ever got to middle school. Their end was certified, and we began to celebrate those that escaped. So if you got out of the South Bronx, you were like a hero. Oh my God, he got out of the... And I thought it was a crime that we would celebrate people getting out of a place that we all knew were going to destroy young people. And so you can tell I'm already getting angry. See, I wasn't going to do the angry thing, but he started talking. But this had a really large impact on me, and all I ever wanted to do was figure out what it took to change those circumstances so those kids would have a chance. That's all. I just thought if they ever gave those kids a fair chance, I don't know what they would have done with their lives, but I know they wouldn't have died early or spent their lives, you know, in jail cells with no hope of ever having a future and raising their families and going on and living out the American dream.
So, I mean, let me pick up on that, because yesterday, obviously, in the keynote, it was a broader message. But actually, I think it's very interesting for us to kind of understand exactly the principles and the fundamentals that you apply in founding and setting up the Harlem Children's Zone as a starting point. So what were the fundamentals that were key to your success or key to the zone's success? And secondly, what actually enabled you to kind of scale it? So go from that one block to the 97.
Yeah. So the keys. None of this is rocket science. And I have told folk, I didn't even invent this. I had listened to people, and they said very logical things, and I just did it, right? So you talk about starting early. And the question, in the States, we have a search for a holy grail that looks like this. We want to figure out the least amount we can spend to create a permanent, right, impact on young people, right? So we want the shortest time and the least amount. And we figured out that if you're a parent, you realize there is no short time, right? It's not like your kid's 4 and now they're good. You don't have to worry about them anymore. It's all right. I mean, we know, and the older your kids get, the more you know that the job is not over. It just gets more and more intense, and then you're worried about high school and drugs, and then you're worried about college and getting them. It doesn't end, but we think with poor kids, you can start early and then say these kids are going to be fine. So this was one fallacy that we believed right away. From birth, our kids are at a disadvantage. Now we have a lot of the brain imaging that we can see what happens when parents use language with children, and the give and the call and response that helps wire those brains. But we began to find out that college-educated folk talk in a much more complex and rich way to kids, and it actually stimulates those brains differently than when you don't talk to kids or when you simply shut down. In my culture, people honestly believed, as African Americans, that kids should be seen but not heard, right? So everything was stop, don't, shut up, don't say. Now all the science says that that is 100% wrong. But now, I don't know, this is not science, this is just my opinion. And I was trying to think of, why did we raise our kids like that? The best I could come up with, for most of our history in America, if you were African American, your intellect did not get you a job. What got you a job was being servile, being quiet, being respectful. So if you acted out at all, you wouldn't get a job. You couldn't question anything. So it probably was a set of skills that helped you get employment before we had the civil rights struggle. But when that changed, as I always say, education didn't change at all, and a lot of our parenting didn't change. So we start with parents with something we call baby college, which is for parents the ages 0 to 3, right? And we teach them what we know about brain science and about the need to stimulate those young brains in really ways that middle class and upper middle class and college educated folk do. And then the other key to this is we stay with those kids. The same kids we have in baby college, we have pre-K programs, elementary, middle school, high school programs, and we provide support for those kids throughout what we call that our pipeline. You get in that pipeline and you stay, because what we have found is the moment in these communities I'm talking about, the moment we stop the intervention, kids revert back to the mean, whatever the mean is in the community. So in Harlem, the mean was all the kids was hustling. You stop with kids at 12, by 13 or 14, that kid was on the street hustling. That's just what it was. So all that good work you did, in about 14 months, it was all gone, and the kid began to do what other kids do. Kids do what other kids do in their communities once they get to be middle school and high school age. So we figured out, look, the moment you stop, if they revert to the mean, you cannot stop. You have to stay with these kids year after year after year and keep them engaged, because that's what happens in middle class communities. So that was a key. This other piece I think that we thought was critical was scale. The culture in communities can support the intellectual development of young people, or it can interfere with it. In Harlem, it interfered with it. And it was a constant, steady drumbeat, a lot from popular culture, which suggested that these kids ought to live lives which involved all risky behaviors, right? The drinking, the smoking, the sex, the guns, the violence. I mean, it is I'm older than you all, so I remember the days when you had to search really hard for something interesting, right, to watch or look at, right, at 10 o'clock at night. There was nothing. And forget 1 o'clock in the morning, TV went off by 12, right? It was just the sound it made. So now you think kids can be stimulated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year by the most graphic, seductive information ever made available, and it absolutely has corrupted the culture in lots of places, right? I'm just talking about, you watch what happens to your kids. They get these messages which are constant. It looks like everybody's having so much fun doing these things that will destroy them, and it never stops. And so we began to say, if you just work with a small number of kids, the larger culture will begin to work against these kids. And so we said, what scale? What does it look like? In that 97 blocks, there's 12,000 kids, right? And we said we had to work with between 70 or 80% of those kids to change the culture in that community. And the reason we did 97 blocks was when a kid walked out of their house, if they walked 1 block and they were in a different culture, guess what, right? They were going to be vulnerable, they were going to be picked on. Once we reached this idea of scale, that we thought the kids are getting the same message on every block, and all of their friends are hearing the same message, you begin to have a chance to have an impact, I think, on that culture. 2 other things I want to mention just about what I think is essential. Using data and being honest about the data. In my community, I tell them, there's a reason people don't want to look at data working in communities like Harlem. The data's bad, right? Who wants to look at bad data, right, all the time? And it's very hard to change that data. It doesn't happen in a week. It doesn't happen in a month. Sometimes it takes many years. And I have found that educators would rather ignore the data and hope and pray that things are getting better, right? Because we're very, you know, we came into the field, we believe, and so you go out and you. But I've just found out that hoping and praying thing without real information, it doesn't work, right? I did a lot of that. My kids didn't do any better. Looking at the data in real time, not the way we do it in New York City. We take tests in April. We get the results back in July or August after school is closed. September comes, no one looks at the data, they don't do anything with the data, they just do whatever they did last year. It's expensive and it's useless. I want data in September, when our schools begin, that tells me what my kids need to know. And then I want to see if they learned it in October. And when they didn't learn it in October, I want to know what the plan is and what we're going to do in November. And it never ends. And part of the challenge of this work is in getting that data and using that data and holding people accountable for very clear objectives, right? You begin to actually see whether or not you're being effective. And everybody has to learn to deal with it. And it is unsettling to people. It's unsettling to know that you worked really hard at something and it didn't work, right? You're like, how'd it go? It's great. So this is the big problem in management with my crew. I got 12,000 kids. I go to any of my managers, I say, how's it going? They say, it's going great. I say, yes, how's it going? Oh, terrific, Mr. Canada. How about you over there? Yeah, Mr. Canada, it's going great. If you have 4 kids, it's not going great. I got 12,000 kids. But part of the challenge I've learned as just an administrator, if you, as the leader, are not looking to find the problems, you will not find it. People will simply tell you it's good. People always manage up. They tell you what they think you want to hear, right? And so really being able to get that data, to use it to drive outcomes is something I think is critical. The last thing that I want to say is that we really believe that you have to involve young people in physically improving their communities. They have to be part of the solution. Young people who end up removing graffiti do not then go that night and write more graffiti where they just took it off. They don't do it. When young people believe their communities are useless, they act like the community is useless. So this is the old Harlem. Trash filled with street, graffiti everywhere, garbage, rats, everything. You're 12, you're drinking a can of soda, there's trash all over the street. I mean, it would be abnormal to walk down to the corner and put that can in a trash, because the trash is everywhere. So you throw the trash like everybody else. You fast forward 6 years, there's no more trash in the street. Same kid comes out and he has that same can. You do not feel comfortable throwing that can in the street. You feel like I need to go down, because that's what we do in our community. And this idea that we can separate kids, how they feel about themselves, how they feel about their future, from the information they're getting from their community that often says you're worthless, you're useless, nobody cares, there's nothing you can do about this, you have to live in this kind of permanent filth and degradation, is something that we took on, and we felt that leaders, we had to train leaders in our community so that they could go out and show other young people, no, we can have a different set of outcomes, we can have a different life. So I think those were some of the founding principles: staying with these kids, reaching scale, using data, making sure that we were rebuilding the community. And I cannot tell you, this rebuilding part, I cannot tell you what happens when young people actually see change happening that they've been part of. People used to define success in Harlem as leaving, right? So a kid was like, yeah, I used to live in Harlem, I got out of here. And you know what happens when people define success as leaving a community? All your talent goes somewhere else. Right? When people begin to define success as I'm going to come back here and be part of it, you suddenly start bringing that talent back into your community. You start capturing, and then those young people are real believers. I have a group of young people grew up in Harlem, they're going to school, they're going to graduate school. You cannot tell them this is not possible and this is not a great place to live, because they helped change it and they helped made it. And now they are deeply invested in ways that you want people to be in community. So I think these are some of the key touchstones that we've been working on.
So, President Obama actually wanted to use Harlem Children's Zone as a model that can be replicated across the US, and from memory, I think it was 20 communities that were going to replicate the model. So one, I'd love to understand how that initiative is progressing. And two, do you think the model is something that has validity and relevance in emerging markets or developing markets and developing countries around the world?
Yeah. So here's one of the big challenges that we found with Promised Neighborhoods. People in really devastated communities, one of the things that happens is that they think their community is devastated for a unique set of reasons that are only particular to their community. So if I'm in Flint, Michigan, which is a devastated community that was part of the auto industry when it left, they think the leaving of the auto industry so devastated their communities, unlike any other community, and I could just go right into the Rust Belt, where all the factories used to be, and they feel exactly the same way. And if I go to Camden, New Jersey, they feel exactly the same. And they use that as an excuse that there is no solution. So one of the challenges in these communities is sense of hope, that you really can come in and make a difference. And I found that that was the biggest obstacle to this work, that there was a set of educators, youth development specialists, and social service folks who had essentially thrown in the towel of hope. They no longer believed. They had a set of reasons that it could not work in their community, and they used those reasons to justify inaction. And I'll give you a perfect example. One of the Promised Neighborhoods is in Minneapolis. So I'm going to Minneapolis, and I'm doing a conversation about the zone. They have all their political people there. And at the end, they were like, oh, great, great. They all clapped. And then one of the elected officials said to me, yeah, Jeff, but you did that in Harlem. This is Minneapolis, as if I did it in the easy place, right? And when he said that, everybody began to shake their heads like, yeah, he said it. That's right. That's right. And I told him this happened to be one of those God moments. Sometimes things happen, God just intervenes. I told him a true story. When I first began the zone, a national foundation was looking to work in communities. And I went and I said, this is perfect. You want to work in communities? That's what I want to do. I have this whole plan. I showed them the plan. And they said, Jeff, we love you. But New York City, Harlem, the education system's too devastated. It's too big. You've got real gang problems. It's unwieldy. This could never work in a big city. We want to go to a nice, small town where we have a chance like Minneapolis. So when I told them that, the people in Minneapolis all started to laugh, right? Because they realized what I said was, you all have come up with a set of excuses so that you don't even have to try again, that you don't even have to attempt this. So the efforts are ongoing. The most complicated thing people are facing is the forming of collaborations, right? Because you've got to have social service, you've got to have good youth, you have to have after school, you have to have schools, you've got to start at birth, you've got to be working with elementary, middle, and high school folk. This calls for a really strong set of professionals. And some communities have that talent, and some communities are developing the talent, and in some communities, they're just simply not ready to do something this ambitious. And part of what we tried to do was figure out which communities, I think that's what the federal government was doing, trying to figure out which communities were really prepared to do that. I think that the reason that I think this is really a useful concept for emerging markets is very simple. The basic challenges that we were facing, a system that was not providing education at all for our decades of failure, a dislocation of skills and employment, young people who were totally disaffected, much more part of the problem than the solution, and families that really did not have a skill set to help prepare their kids, and sometimes it was skill and sometimes it was a set of beliefs, right? They just did not value education. They did not push their kids to be successful. That's what we faced in Harlem. You know, and sometimes, I'll give you an international example of Minneapolis. We had a group from South Africa that came to visit, looked at the zone. They were really, and these were folks who were working directly in communities, and they began to talk to me about drugs and crime. And they said, look, Jeff, I got this Harlem thing, but we've got real gangsters, right? And they've got real guns, and they're part of a narco economy, right, where they're actually, people are sheltering them because they're paying. They're the only folks with money, and they're paying, so it's hard to get rid of them. And they laid out this whole scenario, and no matter what I said to them, they still thought gangsters in Harlem were like cartoon folk, and they had the real gangsters, right? And it is this belief, right, that there's something so unique about your set of circumstances that is different than anything else. And so there was nothing I could do to explain that we dealt with the folks who had guns, and folks still had guns in Harlem, and drugs in Harlem was always a hundreds of millions of dollar business, and lots of folks had decided there was nothing you could do. But this may sound controversial. What I said to my community was I wanted drugs in Harlem to be sold like drugs in upper middle class communities, quietly and anonymously. I did not want Harlem to be an open air market where people just drove down the streets, bought drugs out in the open, where young people thought this was the economy they should get into, and they waited till the other guy got murdered or went to jail so they could take their place and have their year and a half selling drugs before they ended up having the same thing. And that's what I wanted, and that's what we ended up creating. You cannot come in Harlem and openly find drugs anywhere. Yeah, there's still drugs in Harlem. My kids don't see drugs being sold on the streets in the way it was before. This idea that you are powerless against these kind of things, just not true. It's different in every country and every community. It's absolutely different. But we were facing those same problems in Harlem.
So one more question before we go out to questions, and then I'll have a final question. Actually, a little digression. So part of the Promised Neighborhoods was one of the prerequisites from the government to try and find another you in one of those communities? Or not? Is there a Geoffrey Canada in one of those Promised Neighborhoods?
That is the biggest question people have. And Dino, let me tell you what's frustrating me about this question. So you all will get this. When we first started this, everybody told me it couldn't be done, right? You could not go into a place that, you have to understand, Harlem had been losing population for 30 years. People, everyone who could get out of that place got out. No one wanted to live there. And we were saying we were going to turn this place around. We were going to, and they were like, please, get out of here. It can't be done. So then we did it. And then they said, well, you're the only one who could do it. I said, wait a second, you can't have it both ways. You can't say it can't be done, and then when it gets done, you're like the only one who could do it. It's simply not true. President Obama knew it wasn't true because he lives in Chicago, right? And if you live in Chicago, the gangs, the guns, the violence, you understand. But what people didn't have, they didn't have a clear example of how you could bring this all together and actually create a comprehensive set of supports. Let me tell you where I think governments have failed in trying to replicate this work and why we had to do it with private money, right? And what Obama did was he decided to put public money where we use private money. He put public money in to do these comprehensive services. It's a set of comprehensive supports that acts like a family. If you have a child and your child has a toothache, you don't determine whether or not you can treat that kid's toothache, right? It's like, oh, of course you're going to get this. And you don't say, is this going to help with their algebra, right? No, that's not going to help with their algebra. Kid has a toothache, you're going to take care and get them good dental health. That's how we approach our problem. If a kid has a mental health problem, we make sure they get mental health services. Quality, right? Not any old thing, quality. Something that actually, so that's our job. We make sure wherever the gaps are, we fill in the gaps. If we see a parent and there's no bed in the house for the kid, right? We make sure there's a bed. It's just one of those things that we do. So when we go to government and I explain this idea that you've got to get child welfare, probation, the human services that includes welfare, child support, you have to get everybody working together. Every governor and every mayor gets it. They say, you're right, working in silos doesn't work, right? People don't talk to one another. And then they all do, I tell them, don't do this, and then they all do the same thing. They create an interagency task force, right, to come together to tackle this. And then I tell them, but that will not work unless you, Mr. Governor, or you, Ms. Mayor, right, sit on top of that and force these agencies to communicate and work with one another. And then they come up with their other bright suggestion. Why don't you chair it, Jeff? Right? Which is like, no, I'm not going to do that. I have better things to do. And it doesn't work. It won't work for that reason. One entity has to take full responsibility for the entire child, which means also the family, to really make sure these things don't fall through the cracks. And I think that now, I honestly don't think people could have raised the private dollars I raised, right? So before this was done, before we had any evidence, I do think you had to be able to go out and raise a lot of money, and that wasn't possible. Now that we've actually left the blueprint of how to move forward, I think absolutely you can do it. It is not easy, and I'm going to tell you where communities have struggled on collecting data, analyzing the data, because people want to spend. I've got 4 full-time PhDs that work for me in my evaluation department. We have 12,000 kids. I got to know what's going on a regular basis so we can drive those results. Most people don't want to pay for that kind of stuff, right? So they don't want to take it seriously as if there's a science to this. And I think that that's part of why it's difficult for other people to replicate this. If you try and skip over those things, yeah, I believe in evaluation. I'm just not going to hire anybody to do it, right, and give me the information. Then it's not going to work, and you're going to end up, I think, not creating a very effective set of strategies.
So we've obviously got representation from 59 different countries at the forum this year. And I think there's a big representation from emerging, emergent, and developing countries. A lot of people typically look to the mature markets, like the US, like the UK, as sometimes, okay, this is the answer. If there is some pearls of wisdom that you have as to what not to copy from mature markets, because again, the opportunity for emerging markets is amazing. They don't necessarily have the same resources. They're so much more open-minded. Actually, sometimes it's very interesting to understand what are the things not to do, learn from it, and again, we've heard it a lot over the last few days. What can you do to leapfrog? So what are the things not to do?
Well, let me tell you one of the real quagmires that I think people face in this business. There's not enough money to do everything. So what do you actually end up doing? And I find that people mostly do a little of everything, which means they end up doing much of nothing, right? And it's tough because there's you have to face a moral dilemma in saying, I'm going to actually spend my money here versus there, when you know if you don't spend it here, those folks are going to suffer. We were very transparent about this when we started the zone. I said, I'm going to spend 60% of my money on children under 12, right? That my belief was we were in it for the long haul, and if I had this is going to sound harsh, but this is just what we did. If I had an 18-year-old in my community who was reading at a 3rd grade level, I didn't know what I could really do to help that person into the labor market. But I believe I could stop an 8-year-old from becoming that 18-year-old. And my question was, if I did that, then in a 10-year period of time, I would have a different set of 18-year-olds who had a totally different set of outcomes. And I was going to have to live with that decision of how to spend that money. I wasn't going to ignore, right? I wasn't going to ignore that teen population, because young kids look to the teenagers for role models. And if I didn't have any role models for my kids were all going to think that all the kids were selling drugs and other things. So we invested in leadership in those first 7 or 8 years in that upper group. We put most of our money into stopping this thing from continuing. And here's the challenge that I think communities face. We believed in a decade, if we did this right, we'd have a different group of teenagers, and they would be more likely going to college than going to jail. And I didn't know what was going to happen to that current group. We could just kind of do Band-Aids with them, but that was not really the focus. And it turns out that that was right. Now, maybe someone else could have figured out how to do both. We couldn't figure out how to do both. We didn't have the money to do both. I didn't have the expertise to do both. I absolutely believed I could get into those lower grades, change that culture, connect those kids with some role models in their own community, so when you're 9, you're looking at this 15-year-old and he's not doing the wrong thing, he's doing the right thing. And how do we sort of excite the community about this possibility? So I think this was a tough decision. It turns out it was the right decision. People often face this with gangs, and I always thought the way you deal with a gang problem is stop the next generation from entering those gangs. And you got to ride out this current one. But if you stop that next one in 10 years, you're going to have a totally different problem there. This issue of here's something not to follow in the States. When you have the test, right, they often drive your educational policy, even if the science doesn't dictate that's the way you should go. So we start testing kids in the 3rd grade. So schools that have lousy test data, you go into those schools, you say, look, I know your 3rd graders aren't doing well. You're testing 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th. So you're going to spend all your time worrying about the 3rd graders, but I'm going to tell you, invest in those kindergarten kids, because in 3 years, they're going to be there. And they say, yeah, but I may not be here if I don't get my 3rd grade test scores up. So I'm going to ignore the kindergarten. I want to work on the third grade. I say, look, they've been doing that for 20 years. It hasn't worked. Get those kids early, get them ready, and then, but if you don't have, and I think it's a bit of a luxury, if you don't have the luxury of time, right, to say that I can give myself enough time to actually get the outcomes, to prove my point, you're liable to churn, right, to just go in, work on the tough end, and not really do that heavy investment where you know 2 or 3 years from now, you're going to get a big payoff. It's going to be clear to everybody this strategy is working by the results that you're getting. So the last thing I'm going to say, and people, I think in a meeting I had today, this came up so often, I'm going to say this again. One of the biggest barriers to education reform are the formal structures which insist that the status quo continue. I'm going to use it just as unions for a placeholder, but it may not be. There's a group of adults that are invested in things staying the same, and they are very strong. In this business is so hard. The last thing you need is, I think, an organized effort to stop any success. Because this is what I've noticed for people. It actually takes courage to go out and change education. Now that sounds funny. I know people it takes courage to go fight a war. If you really go in education reform, it takes courage, because this is what's going to happen. You're going to say some unpopular things. You're going to be attacked. And the first time you fail at anything, people are going to pile on you so hard that it's going to make you want to shut up, right? And just try and make it through and not say anything to anybody. So I've found that educators, when they're young, they tend to be full of fire. And in 3 or 4 years, all that fire is gone. They are just surviving. And part of what it is the courage it takes to know you're right even when you mess up. You're in this business, you're going to do some stuff, it's not going to work. And people are going to call you out and say, look, Jeff, look at those scores, I told you. And that's okay. You've got to be able to recoup, not back down, and go out and continue to improve in a way that allows you to end up getting the evidence. So I think these powerful forces, often people will not talk about them. They won't confront them. In most of the states, the people who are the most against innovation are the unions. That's their job. That's what they get paid to do. These schools that we run, the charter schools, aren't unionized. We work in plenty of unionized schools, so I'm not against the unions. I'm against people who won't allow you to do anything different, right? When it comes to education, I'll give one clear example of that. When I was at the Harvard Graduate School in education in the 70s. So I'm there, a big study comes out, and it's talking about poor kids, and it says, if you look at where poor kids finish up in June, and then you look at where they are in September when school opens up again, because we're off July and August, those kids actually lose ground, right? And with science. Then every 7 to 8 years, the same thing came out. And one day I said, well, if that's the issue, why don't we have schools that run in the summertime so our kids won't? People laughed. They were like, you can't do that. I said, you really couldn't do that? You know, you can't do that. I like, but the evidence is clear that the kids, who cares about the evidence? Who cares about that? No one, the evidence is clear. Not one school system in the United States that I know of has used that evidence to say, therefore we should make sure our kids are learning in the summertime so they actually don't go backwards. So that's how strong these forces are that stop innovation. So my schools that I run are open in July. We're open all July, right? But it's a charter school, it's not under the, and people hate us for it. They just hate it, they're angry about it. And when people are angry, they always are blogging, they're saying all of these nasty things. And I have found that that drives a lot of reformers out of the business. They just can't take the heat because it's constant. And everything you do good, someone is picking at it saying, no, let me tell you why this thing's really not true. They're really creaming, they've got these other kids. And you just have to be prepared to fight for your communities if you really are, I think, love your children. So the idea of taking on these issues, not allowing, I think, the powerful forces to push back, it is the reason in the States these communities have failed for as long as they have. And it is simply that. And it takes courageous people to go and tackle that stuff.
Thank you, Jeff. Guys, questions on the floor. We've got, is there a mic or should we just? Okay, sir, first to you. I don't think there's a mic, so we'll project.
I'm privileged to hear from you I want to give you the situation here in the Gulf.
Good.
We are privileged with lots of resources and commitment of leadership, and we have huge projects in the field of education. And yet societies are not happy about the outcomes. So what is the one advice that you can give us so that we can take the heat and continue?
Yes, so this is interesting because I've met a number of folk who, in looking at their outcomes, have realized that education now, we really have developed a worldwide competitive system. There's just no avoiding it. You're not just competing sort of locally or even regionally. You're competing with folk who are coming from all the other countries around the world. And I think that this idea that we've got to raise the benchmark is something that is frightening all of the countries. And there's been two responses to this. And I heard this here a number of times. In the States, we used something called the Common Core. We looked at our PISA results. They were terrible. We said, look, our curriculum's not challenging enough. Kids are getting 90s, but when you look at what that 90 means, it really means a 30 if we looked at it internationally, so we need to change. We created the Common Core, which showed how lousy our kids were doing. Everybody got so upset about the fact of telling the truth about how lousy it was, they said, let's go back to the old test. And people want to go back to the test where everybody passes so they can feel good, right, and feel like things are going fine. And I've heard that happening in a number of places where people have decided, let's not tell the truth about it. It upsets too many people. And then people get upset, and then they start yelling, so let's change the test. One of the things that I think helps is to really expose folk to the business community. In the U.S., the strongest advocates for education, our business community, because they can't find employees who have skills that they can use. And the other place is in the military. Our military can't find all of our kids. Our education's so lousy, they can't join the Army. 75% of American kids cannot qualify for military service. 75%. It is astounding how bad it is. And so we've been using these folks to help convince local governors, mayors, and others that this is a national crisis and we've got to step up our game. So I think thinking about a campaign that involves, now educators, they will not listen to. Folks who because we talk in sort of an echo chamber. We had to get other folks that people feel like, oh, these people really matter, if they come in and say, look, this is a disaster. We're going to hold you guys accountable, because all of our politicians need these folks to help run their campaigns, and they really do care about what they think. They like me, but they don't really care about what I think. I'm not going to give them any money. So, I mean, that's just the reality, and we realize, I call it that, the unusual suspects. We had to really go and recruit the unusual suspects and make this case for us, that this is important for the city of New York, it's important for the state, and it's important for the country that we raise these standards. And having said that, it's not a layup. It's not like they all said, yes, fine. It's just a fight that I think we're going to have to continue. But you got to get other people other than educators into this conversation.
The lady there.
Yes, hi. Thank you for being here. Tinley Gilbert. I'm a resident of Dubai by way of New York City and Chicago.
Ooh.
So you may know my first question, which is, can we replicate it in Chicago? Chicago is a war zone right now down there.
It is a war zone.
My second question and hope is that maybe you'd consider a position in the government, helping us change it in the
He
U.S.
said no before. I don't know.
Yeah, no, well, look, I am not going into government, and it's reasons I would not be an effective person in government, right? Because you really are serving the president or the governor or someone else like that, and the politics of this are I'm too emotional about this now. I think I've gotten too old, and I just feel like I don't know how much more time I have, but I haven't seen this progress at a level that I think is keeping up with the crisis. I think the crisis is overtaking us. And I don't think we're quite prepared for that. And I don't feel like I could wait out a year or two on the sideline. So that's for that. But let me just say so if you don't know Chicago, they are having a war in Chicago. The gangs are totally out of control. But there's a place that's actually worse than Chicago. which is California, the whole state. California jails are so overcrowded that the United States Supreme Court ruled it cruel and unusual punishment to lock up people and put them in those places. And both of these places did the same thing. When we were first creating this work, so you go back 20 years, I went to California and I said to folk, your belief that you can police your way out of this situation, right? You're not going to improve the education and other things. What you're going to do is get more and more police. You're going to lock up more and more people. You're going to get tougher on crime. You're going to give these kids tougher and tougher sentences and think you're going to change that. Is going to create a nightmare scenario, because this going to jail can become ordinary and normative, which is what it's become, ordinary and normative, at an expense that is unbelievable, right? The average cost in New York State to incarcerate a person for a year is $30,000 a year. I know no school system spending that kind of money educating. You know what it is in New York State? $60,000 a year for 1 year to lock somebody up, and you could not guess what the number is in New York City. You couldn't guess it. $167,000 a year. 1 year. We have 12,000 people in jails in New York City, $167,000 a year. Now this is a total failure. You get zero outcomes for that money, and yet that's where people invested the money. What I said, it's funny because when the administration replicated our work, what I said was the answer to this rampant criminality is actually to train a group of leaders who actively can compete with the gangs. Folks have just not wanted to make that, because it's not going to happen in a year or two, right? Everybody tries to tackle the current gangsters, right? These are guys 17, 18, 19, instead of thinking about those 9 and 10-year-olds who are going to be the future gangsters. Because you know what's going to happen to those current gangsters? In 10 years, they're all going to be gone one way or the other. Absolutely. The only question is, are they going to be replaced? And this idea of targeting, and this is so straightforward, yet I cannot convince any of these communities to do it, to do a massive investment in that younger group to make sure they don't end up becoming, because people, again, they feel like you're abandoning and this kid's creating a crisis. So this is kind of this short-sighted thinking that I think has interfered. And unfortunately, these have become now permanent fixtures in these communities. It's going to take a pretty massive investment to dislodge this. And communities feel like they don't have the money, and I argue they don't have the money to continue to do this, right? You've got to, it's one of these initial investments you just have to make. Yeah, it's going to cost you money now, you're going to get the savings later, and no one wants to deal with the later savings, so they don't want to spend the money now. The program we used was, when I mentioned the President Clinton, his national service, it's called AmeriCorps. We hire these kids straight from the street to come in and do service with us. And one of the places they do service is right on the streets. So here's an example of how you let crime get out of control and some of the things you have to do to deal with it. So we had the same, we have all the gangs in Harlem and all of that stuff. So I'm talking to my team one day, Halloween is coming. It's about 5 years ago. I'm talking to my team, I said, okay, what's the plan for Halloween? They said, we have to close all of our programs on Halloween. It's like a Thursday. I think, we're going to close the programs. Why are we going to close the program? They said, because the Bloods, right, an organized gang called the Bloods sent out an email. I said, stop right there. The Bloods are on email? I mean, who knew? I didn't know. They were like, yeah, the email went all over the city, and they said they're going to slice any girl out. They're going to slice her face with a razor blade. I said, really? I said, really? I said, and our response is what? To close all of our programs because a group of 15-year-olds have made a threat? And I said, I don't think so. I said, I'm going to get adults on every single corner. I said, everybody's job at 3 o'clock is to stand outside. There will be nobody, and we're going to have regular Halloween. Guess what happens when all the adults come out? Kids act like kids. When they're like, why are all these grown-ups out here? What's going on? Every corner we go, there's grown, they all looking at us, what's happening, right? Because they become kids again. When grown-ups are gone, right, the kids think they run things. And so part of this is we've given up these territories, right? We have something we call safety. We create safety alleys where I actually put my employees out with little lanterns at night, little battery lanterns, and they give a safe call. Any kid who wants safety walking through the community, they know exactly where to go. Parents know exactly. But this is a psychological warfare, right? We're saying to the gangsters, we're out here. You're not controlling this. We're controlling this area, right? So one of the ways we knew it was working is they came to me. There had been a shooting in Harlem, and they said, Jeff, they waited till all of us left, and then I said, yeah, because they know we're out there to stop that kind of stuff, and they're respecting it. Why? Because their brothers and sisters are in our program. And believe it or not, even the gangsters don't want their sisters and brothers being harmed. So they'll say, no, you go down here where the Harlem Children's Zone is when you come in, right? And so this idea that you've got to have active people, I tell folk, this work is not for the faint of heart, right? This is the same problem the South Africans were asking me. This is not for the faint of heart. But you know who will do it? Those very same kids who live in that community. Not for the AmeriCorps are very modest. It's a very modest allowance that they give these kids. But these young people live in those communities. They know who the folk are. They're able to come in and provide that kind of support. We call them our peacemakers. And they were the ones who were there to make sure we taught kids different kind of conflict resolution. And so it's not like it's fixed, it's over. It's an active, right now, I am telling you, tomorrow I'll get 3 emails of this happened, that happened, this other thing. But everybody knows that we're in the battle for our kids. This is one thing I'm saying this about drugs, drug sales. The business of drugs, so forget whether it's good or bad. I'm taking the more, I have strong feelings about what it does to our communities, but it's a business with a high turnover, right? So if you're a drug dealer, your employees, right, you're gonna have to constantly replenish those employees because they get shot, they go to jail, and you need new. Who do you think they need to fill the ranks? They need my kids. So we're both out there, but just think, they're out there nights, they're out there weekends, they're out there all the time trying to recruit my kids. And if you're in this business, right, and you stop at 3 o'clock, guess what happens? So no, I'm in active competition with the drug dealers. When they're open, so am I. They want my kids and I want my kids, and we know that we're in competition. They do not like me, I do not like them, right? But they respect the fact that I have their brothers and sisters, and I have a vision that is not going to be them on the corners. And so I think that allows us to have safety. I've never had one of my staff who's been hurt or anything else in this. We don't actively go and say, hey, you guys, get off the corner. We just say, in 3 years, we're going to make sure none of my kids are on this corner. And guess what? They all end up being my kids, right? So that just is the way and it doesn't happen overnight, right? A decade later, guess what you have? You have a small number of people who are in that business and a vast majority of folk who are now thinking about how they can go to college to get a job instead of standing on those corners.
I'm going to do one more question. Shabana.
Thank you very much. I'll try to keep this short. I'm from Afghanistan, and first of all, you're such an amazing inspiration. Every word you say, I want to hear you all day long. So much of what you've said resonated so well with me. When you talked about seeing success as kids returning back to Harlem as opposed to leaving that place, and this is something we as a country are struggling with. A lot of people who go abroad stay abroad. Yeah. They don't go back to Afghanistan. Yes. And so when I saw my success in returning to Afghanistan for a year, at least people would call me stupid for wanting to come back to Afghanistan. I want to ask one specific and more technical question.
Yep.
Just like you, and I don't, when I started the school in Afghanistan, it's the first boarding school for girls. At the age of 18, people just looked at me and said, you're very ambitious, good luck. But it was a very nice way of saying this is not going anywhere. And I meet people, and I continue to meet a lot of people who say this is amazing work you're doing, but then it doesn't often go beyond that. How do you raise money for your cause? How would you go about that? One. The other thing is, we have in April election coming up in Afghanistan. Would you consider becoming the president?
Wait, so I need to answer the first question on the fundraising. On the fundraising, Shabana, you need to be angry. If you're angry all the time, you will go and raise the money, right? But no, I'm going to let him answer seriously.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me just congratulate you. It is, when I was in college, and I told my professors, I wanted to go back into the inner city. We called it the ghetto then. People, they laughed. They were like, "You're never going to do that." They said, "You're going to end up working for IBM." or say, "You're not going to go in there and get an education like this. Why would you do that?" Right? And it was so deflating to me to have people I really respected look at me and say things like that. Right? So one of the end results, and this is a problem with education in general, is one of the reasons we don't have great teachers. You look at the Netherlands, they hire from the top third. In the States, we hire from the bottom third. Part of it is how people feel about people who go into this profession. They don't think they're smart. They don't think they're talented. So I'm at Bowdoin. It's a small, really exclusive liberal arts college up in Maine. It's my senior year, and I'm looking. All I wanted to do was find the answers. I told you from a little kid. So every class I took, it was looking for an answer. If I took a class in religion, it was because religion was so powerful in some places as being an antidote against despair. So I was doing all these things. And my senior year, I took a class in pharmacology because the heroin epidemic was sweeping through my community in the 70s. And I took a class in physiology because I thought that the actual physical space so many people were living in was having an impact on their ability to focus and think. And so I took both of the classes. I got A's in the classes, and the head of chemistry and biology, the dean came in and said, "Jeff, you're really smart." And I said, "Thank you." They said, "No, you got A's in hard science. You could be a doctor." I said, "That's great. I don't really want to be a doctor. I want to be a teacher." They said, "Teacher? Why would you want to be a teacher? You could be a doctor. Don't you understand what this means?" And I said, "Yeah." And they said, "No, you don't. No, you don't." So they started a 2-week campaign to convince me to become a doctor. And now I'm 22, I'm fairly impressionable. And I relent and I give in. And I sign up to go, and I had to take another semester of science classes before I could go to pre-med school. And just as I was about to go in, the only reason I didn't become a doctor was I realized I don't like sick people, right? I mean, it would just hit me. It's like, why would I do this? I don't want to do this. And I did, but I was struck with what people felt about my profession, that they felt like I was too smart to go into education. Why would I waste my life doing something like that? And I realized that in the same way that people have expectations about poor kids, people have expectations about what smart kids do. And one of the things was they don't go back and do what you want to do. So I applaud you for resisting that. Now, on the issue of raising money, let me tell you what I found. Raising money is an art form. There is a science to it the same as any other sciences. Mostly we have been taught it is the person that writes the best proposal who gets the money. I was such a failure. I couldn't raise any money. I thought I was a good writer. I wrote and I spent all my time writing and writing and writing, and I raised no money whatsoever. And I don't raise any money, and I haven't in 15 years from writing proposals. I haven't raised any money. I realized there were probably people who could do that. They were mostly working, they were PhDs in English who couldn't find any other job. They were grant writers, that's all they wrote. This idea, and then I thought it was the quality of what you were doing. That if you could only show people how good it was, they would then respond and give you money. Nope, that didn't work either. And I spent a lot of time just saying, no, we must not have been good enough. I have to get, the key to raising money is finding people who have money and forming relationships with them. That's the only way I know, and that's whether it's in the foundation world or in the private world. People give to people they believe in. And they give, when they associate with causes, and I heard someone say something about how much people love animals versus children. Well, it's true. It's true. There's a group of folk who would give quickly. You show them a picture of a starving dog and they would write a check, and you show a kid, they wouldn't even think about giving any money. And that's because we're wired in different ways. And I find, don't spend your time, right, trying to convince them folk that they shouldn't be giving to the animals, right? Find people who you can convince that they can do good with their money. The biggest challenge I found with folk in whether or not they will support a cause is whether or not there's real evidence that that cause makes a difference. this return on investment that people have in their mind is a real thing. And building the case is absolutely critical. But I will tell you this, you can build a great case. We raise all of our money by people actually coming and seeing what we do. If you can't get them there, we can't raise the money. People listen, but people, well, see, but you know what? You say that and laugh, but I'm going to tell you, then you're going to have to bring Afghanistan to them. And it is, I am the king of the dog and pony show, right? I mean, because I realized this is now my job. It's not what I wanted to do, but because I needed the resources, I had to figure out how to do that. And when people wouldn't come to Harlem, I had to bring Harlem to people so that they could actually experience why this was better than what else they were giving. The only other thing I'm going to say is I've been amazed at how shallow a pool people are looking for money in. People ignore lots of opportunities where people have money. They just simply don't know the industries. They don't reach out to folk. They haven't sort of asked around and tried to figure out who their friends are. And the last point about this is that most folk in our business who are practitioners don't know how to ask for money. They just don't know how to close a deal, right? That you go in, you'll do all of this stuff. This is what I found about wealthy people. If you don't ask them for money, they are not giving it to you. Right? I don't care if they come, they love it, they'll be crying with the kids. That's the greatest experience I ever had. They won't write you $1. Right before they go, I say, excuse me, now can you give me a check, please? I really need some money. And if you're not that direct, you will not get the money. And I have found that it seems when, you know, I call it my begging, that's what I do. But I am good at it. But closing a deal, how you close a deal, how you follow up, when you do the ask, that there's a real science to that. And I find that most folk who are in the business end of this don't know anything about that. And what they hope is they're going to hire a fund developer who's then going to do it. No, I have a great fund developer in the development department. No one gives them a dime. As the CEO, it is my job to go out and make this sale and close this deal. And so most CEOs are busy. You don't want to spend your time doing it. I have to spend my time doing that. And there becomes a cost benefit. The more money you have to raise, the less time you can spend on your program, right? And so now you didn't get in this to raise money. You got in this to do the work. Well, you know what happens? There becomes a point in time where if you need the resource, you have to find somebody else who can do the work while you go raise the money, which is a challenge. And that challenge, a lot of folk have never crossed that over. They just said, nope, I'm doing work. I do not want to do fundraising all the time. I'd rather do this here. But people only give to the CEO. And getting out there, and if you're trying to compete with me, right, and I'm there, and I'm ready, and I'm prepared to go, and you're trying to send somebody else to do it, you're not going to beat me in that one, right? Because the convincing, people invest in individuals. They invest in leaders. They want, I don't care if it's regular business, they want to know. They meet Dino, they say, this guy is really smart, I'm going to make an investment, or he's not. Right? It's not, there's no way around it. You can't send your number 2 or your number 3, and it becomes a real challenge in fundraising. So part of this is the science of it, which is really serious, and the other thing is not wasting. When I realized all that time I was spending writing those proposals were not delivering anything, right? It just wasn't working. Whatever it was, I couldn't break through. I had to figure out another way. I spent a lot of time learning how to meet people, right, and trying to figure out these connections. This is like 7 degrees of separation. Once you find one wealthy person, there's a lot of stuff around that, and you just got to go out and you got to work that, right? And it's just one of those things that you got to do, and I will tell you, it is hard work. And most folks don't think it's part of their job, but it's part of the job.
Thank you so much.
So last question from me, which is something that we've been wanting to ask all our mentors at the end of these sessions. What is the one idea that you're most hopeful for, that you think will be transformative for education, not just in the US, but globally over the next 5 years, the next decade, and hopefully into the future?
Well, I am really convinced that technology is going to be a huge, huge educational tool. I do not think it's there yet. I do not, for lots of reasons, right? We've got lots of connectivity issues. We've got folks who are isolated, they're off the grid and other things. And we've got the programming, which is still, to me, pretty crappy, right? That the people who really got the programming down are all the game people, right? All your kids, they play video games, right? It's fascinating. You don't play them. The folks doing it, they're geniuses because they have tapped right into the main senses. It's visual, tactile, auditory, instantly all at the same time. So it actually transports you to a different world, right? Because all the senses are engaged. Someone mentioned they didn't have the oral, the smell I was hearing on today. But they're going to get that. They are so far ahead of, I think, where the education programming is right now, which is slow, it's clunky, it doesn't give you much satisfaction, it still feels a lot like school. People have just started to figure out there's a real market in this. And there are a bunch of people now trying to solve this. And they're trying to figure out how that technology can get better. So I think it's I think in 6 years, I don't think this is a tomorrow. There's some stuff, we're using a lot of technology now in our school, but I don't think this is a tomorrow. But I think all educators have to pay close attention to this because it could be a real game changer. There is no way that you can substitute a mediocre teacher for a great teacher. It's just no way. But could you bring that great teacher into your school? The answer is absolutely yes. Now, right now, it's not interactive enough, and I don't think we've created the space where this thing can be really, really useful. But we're close, and we're getting closer, and I think that there's some hope there. Let me tell you the corollary to this. The science of education is getting clearer. People are stopping the fads. That, you know, there's a new fad coming out every week. Oh, let's do this. Let's do the new math. I think folks are now starting to really put together what it's going to take. There's a guy, he's an economist from Harvard. His name is Roland Fryer. And Roland has been convinced that he can find the secret sauce. And he's trying to use just pure science. What works, what doesn't. The folks who went through some of the exercises in terms of where to place your money they were doing, you know, that's a science experiment. Now, the thing about science is a lot of people reject it, right? It's like global warming. Some people believe in it, some people don't, right? But there is a science to education, and real educators know it. I think trying to discover the science and disseminate that widely, not just with educators. One of the things we've been doing is we've been disseminating the science to our business community and our religious community, trying to get other folk to understand, well, why do you say that, right? Why are you for evaluation of teachers? Why do you think there needs to be data? That this is important that we get this science out there and people begin to believe this. A lot of, I think, education has been a hodgepodge of hopes and dreams. It hasn't worked and people have become frustrated. And people have given up. I think we're at a place now where the science is getting clearer and clearer, and we're behind the science. The science is not actually transforming what's happening in the classroom right now because of some of the other barriers. But I think that because of the crisis we have in the economies around this country, and that people are, even manufacturing jobs are going to require higher and higher skills. I think countries are beginning to figure out that we better take this stuff seriously. And I think that pressure, I think if suddenly you got a world economy that everybody's unemployment rates improved by 12 or 14%, I think education would stay dormant. But I think everybody say everything's fine. And I see no sign that that is happening. And this issue that we've got to get folks prepared. And we're all competing now, and it's all about skills, is something that I think is going to allow this science to become more important. And the only other thing I'll say is finding, not reinventing the wheel, finding folk who actually know what to do and how to do it is something that we are just so far behind everyone else. Everybody feels like they have to invent it themselves. I've got to be the one to come up with the grand solution. I've spent most of my career traveling around trying to figure out what other people are doing and saying, why can't we do that? Is that going to work? What's the evidence behind this? Let's go out. Let's not try and think of it ourselves. Let's find out what the best science is and use it. That's where I think that's going to be what's going to launch us into the future. And I believe countries that tackle this sooner rather than later are going to be leaders in this. And countries that, for lots of what looks like practical reasons, we just don't have the resources to do the investment. We just don't have, that people who don't solve those, they're going to find themselves at a bigger and bigger disadvantage as time moves forward.
Jeff, that was a privilege. Thank you very much. Thank you guys for being with us. We appreciate it.